All right, we should be ready to get started. So we're going to be working with period 6 today. Period 6 is going to be 1865 to 1898. This is the end of the Civil War through the start of and the conclusion of the Spanish-American War. And so they're weaving all that stuff together. There's a weird overlap with period 7, where period 7 goes from 1890 to 1945. And that's just with the idea that they're trying to lay out for you progressivism. As many of us will define it, they'll see this like a Teddy Roosevelt thing. But they'll see progressivism as being part of what's coming out of the farmers' movements and other trends that you see happening in the late 1800s. Oftentimes, kids will find that this time period is tricky when it comes to the farmers' movements and the economics and whatever, and so that's why we spend an awful lot of time doing that. So inside class, we did games like the sharecropping game, farm game, Steel Empire, and whatever. That's where those games really come to bear at this moment, is giving you those bigger economic insights that can help you out with the test itself. Anything you need to have retaught today is absolutely fair game, though. So if you need anything from me, just let me know and we can be able to run through that for you. The first page that you see going on when you move into the key concept of 6.1 is the idea of making sure that you understand where industrialization is coming from. So they'll mention that there's large-scale industrial production that is accompanied by these things. Number one, massive technological change, expanding international communication networks, pro-growth government business policies is going to create economic development and business consolidation. And so one of the things that I would highlight for you is this is indicating that they want to be able to handle causation of the Industrial Revolution essay in the late 1800s. When I think about a causation question, most of the kids who end up writing an essay like that are going to write instead about like the life stories of Carnegie and Rockefeller and Morgan, and they're going to start after the Civil War is done. I would encourage you to think about the Civil War as the starting point of that story, and it'll get a whole lot easier for you. And what I've been building up for you guys is the idea that for the United States, we have won multiple wars, not because we're genetically better than anybody else, because that's racist. Instead, we've got an idea that's going on inside of our country that our industrial capability and our natural resources give us advantages where we can outproduce enemies when we go to war with them. So notice how they've got right here that following the Civil War, we created government subsidies for transportation and communication systems that opened up markets in the United States. The laws that I would encourage you to think about with this would be things like the Transcontinental Railroad, which is encouraging the creation of communication, especially telegraph lines out west. But I would encourage you to think about also what's happening during the Civil War, because part of the reason why Lincoln ends up winning the Civil War is because of the industrial might the United States has during the Civil War itself. So he does a number of different things. Number one, the way that I would look at Lincoln during the Civil War is I would remember his two great inspirations. For Abraham Lincoln, he's from Kentucky, and his mentor was Henry Clay. When we think about Henry Clay, his American system was all about the idea of creating a national banking system with the bus. And remember, Abe Lincoln, during his presidency, is going to create the national banks. First national, second national of certain states and whatever, with regulations and rules and ability to sell bonds and that sort of stuff. Henry Clay's American system was also with the idea that you create tariffs to protect businesses, and that's a hallmark of the late 1800s. But then thirdly, it was about infrastructure, with the idea of building canals and those sorts of things that Lincoln's going to mimic with the building of the railroads. Henry Clay's inspiration is Alexander Hamilton, who believes in loose constructionism, that you can stretch the Constitution with the idea that you can be pro-business and helping the development of business inside the United States. So when I think about what's happening in this box right here, thinking about Lincoln's pro-business tendencies, using the industry to try to help build up the war effort, he is somebody who's willing to be loose constructionist with money. So remember, he's going to create greenbacks. It's going to create inflation and allow the economy to start moving better. So he's got an awful lot of stuff that he's doing that is going to help create a really nice environment for the boom of businesses. He's also going to be giving out government contracts to make things like weapons for the war, and those factories will then get big. After the war, they'll convert to peacetime stuff, and they'll be able to use the trains to ship stuff across the country, just like you saw in World War I and World War II. So there's a comparison between those three that you can easily be playing out. When you look at your businesses that are making use of technological innovations, what you want to be thinking about there is certain specific inventions that revolutionize things. In my mind, the Bessemer process is the best example that you can use right there. Bessemer process allowing people to mass produce steel is going to then influence all of our businesses, whether it's transportation or skyscrapers or all sorts of new inventions that will use steel instead of iron or other sorts of stuff, and that's going to make their products more durable. You're also going to find that there's more access to natural resources. This is your West. So we have more access to stuff like timber and farm products and mining and cattle and all these other elements that are coming from the West down the trains into the urban areas. We redesign our financial and management structures. And so one of the hallmarks for the rise of big business is not just going to be what the government is doing with their banking system, but this is also the rise of monopolies. So they want to be able to speak intelligently to why that took place, and they'll allude to that later on in your concept outline. They also want you to think about advances in marketing. And back in this chapter, we were talking about like Sears and Roebuck and catalogs that they were sending out along the railroad, so you could telegraph your message back or mail it for whatever product you wanted, and then it could be shipped out to you on the train. And a growing labor force that is exploding. And so we're going to find that there's both a population boom based on birth and also migration that they want to be able to identify. All of these are factors that lead to the rise of big business in the late 1800s. That's a cause and effect sort of question. What is causing this boom for factories in the late 1800s? Letter C is something that we discussed in class quite a bit, and it's a set of terms that I'm hoping you locked into. The terms are inflation and deflation. So you see that the price of many goods decrease. So even though we have monopolies, they're going to figure out how to mass produce stuff and become efficient. Like Rockefeller and Carnegie will mass produce things, making it more efficient. They can then lower costs while still making a profit. So what will happen in the late 1800s is people's wages will stay pretty flat, but when the price of everything starts dropping, their real wages feel like they're going up. So even though they're not getting pay raises so much, they're still feeling like their buying power is getting better and better, and they're living a higher standard of living. This is only going to happen, though, during economic good times. So during bad times, you're going to find that people on the bottom end of the spectrum, when they lose their jobs, they're going to find themselves in really deep difficulty. But people in the middle to upper income groups are doing great. Upper income group, though, is really smashing it. So the gap between rich and poor is huge. For letter D, you're going to see that there are different business structures that we need to be able to run through. And so there are 4 different groupings that we discussed in class. And I can describe or draw any of these if you need any of them. So number 1, a monopoly. Monopoly is one person owning all the businesses in a certain field. And we talked about vertical and horizontal integration. So horizontal integration is buying up like all the gas stations in a town. Vertical integration is buying up all the stuff that makes gasoline so that you own all the elements of production. Carnegie was famous for his vertical integration where he bought up like iron mines and transportation networks and steel mills and so on. So are you guys good with those sorts of monopolies first, or is there any more explanation needed? Cool. Second thing you need to be able to describe is how Rockefeller transforms his monopoly into a trust, where he builds a trust company with a board of trustees that is going to be, in his case, Standard Oil Trust, and he's going to give that company all of his oil businesses, but then Rockefeller will own that trust company. So technically, Rockefeller doesn't own all the oil businesses in the United States. He owns the company that owns all the oil companies in the United States. And that wrinkle is going to keep him safe from anti-monopoly legislation in the late 1800s. The third thing you need to be able to describe is a holding company. And a holding company is where you build a company in a state that is very much not interested in regulations, like in New Jersey, and then you build a headquarters in that place so when people try to regulate your business in the state that they're in, they can't because your home state is the one that doesn't permit regulation. And then finally, interlocking directorates is the last term you need to know. These board of directors on trusts, many of those people on the board of directors will be on multiple different boards of directors. So the same like 20 to 30 people own a massive number of businesses inside the United States because they're involved in the decision making on all these different trustee boards. Are any of those confusing enough that you need them clarified more before I move on? Sweet. So down here at the bottom of the page, business and foreign policy makers increasingly looked outside the United States in order to gain influence and control over markets and natural resources in these three areas. So remember why this is happening. This is your imperialism movement that's taking off. And when it comes to economics, many of these people want natural resources. They want to sell to markets outside the country. And our big issue is those gigantic tariffs that you have in the late 1800s. So when you think about those high tariffs that we have going into the late 1800s, the way to get around them is if we absorb a new country like Hawaii into the United States, we can then trade with them without a tariff because they're now inside of the United States tax sphere and we're now safe. These are all elements that can be used then in a good essay to explain why the industrialization of the Gilded Age took place. And remember, most of your competition will just write a fun story about how Carnegie and Rockefeller were doing things. Your goal is then, could you use a huge number of these items inside your essays, but when it comes to your thesis just needs to have a couple big categories. And so you should have 2 or 3 of these big ideas that organize your essay, and then your essay can float to other places beyond your thesis with smaller topics that you're going to be getting into. So take a moment with your neighbors, turn to them, and if you were given a cause of industrialization during the Gilded Age essay, think about what your thesis would be about the big things that you would use to explain why that took place, what caused it. You guys ready to move on then? Any questions about what I just asked you to do? You guys good? Sweet. So next thing they want you to talk about is they want you to be able to talk about how there were many different perspectives on the economy and labor that developed during this time period of financial panics and downturns. So this is where your Steel Empire game comes in, because you guys learned during that game that we have the rule of threes in the late 1800s. We really crashed hard in 1873. And it was during that crash that many of you guys figured out how the game worked, that when the economy crashes, you experience a deflationary cycle where the price of everything dropped. But for many of you guys, that was something that was fun up until like year 4 of the Panic of 1873, which is known as the Long Panic. Because for many of you guys, you realize this is a good time to build up your monopoly by buying stuff, but many of you guys were in danger of going bankrupt at that moment. And so you really couldn't take advantage unless you were one of the few people that really planned well going into that crash. You're then going to have a small panic in the Panic of 1883, and then you're going to have a massive crash in 1893. And each of those things are going to cause us to rethink how does our economy work, because the prevalent viewpoint by conservatives during this time period, Democratic and Republican, is the idea of laissez-faire economics. When I taught you this, I gave you the premise that I thought that laissez-faire was more propaganda than actual reality, because laissez-faire is hands-off business and allowing the markets to run the way they wanted to. But during this time period, they've got very high tariffs. They're using the military to crush unions who are trying to go on strike. They are very much pro-business. And so it's laissez-faire in the idea that it's not doing anything to aid the workers, but it's not necessarily doing anything to keep itself totally out. They're being pro-business to try to build up our factory structure. Our workforce is going to be getting much bigger during this time, and it's happening for a number of different reasons. First of all, there's going to be a brand new agricultural revolution take place where they are mechanizing. With mechanization, they're using things like the McCormick reaper, and that means you need less farm hands to do the same amount of farming. And so those kids are now being pushed off the farm. And if you remember from geography last year, this is where push-pull factors are going to become really big if you can incorporate them in your essays. These kids are being pulled to the cities for the attraction of jobs because they are no longer needed for farming. This is also your era of Southern and Eastern European immigration. These are our new immigrants who come to America, largely unskilled from places like Italy, Poland, Russia. Jewish immigrants and so on are coming to America. And they're looking for jobs because their situation's pretty desperate over in Europe. So that's definitely a push factor out of Europe, a pull factor over here. But you'll remember when we have waves of people coming into the country, this is creating large numbers of workers who are inside these factories. Many of these factories are not the nicest place to work. And so when we think about labor and management battling over these conditions, this is where your unions come to play. These unions are being inspired by immigrants who are bringing over the idea of anarchism, socialism, communism, as well as labor unions. And the two labor unions for the late 1800s that are key are, number one, Knights of Labor, our first major labor union that has both skilled and unskilled workers. The Knights of Labor are going to be derailed by the Haymarket riot during the Panic of 1873, where they're going to be engaged in a strike. They're going to go on strike in Chicago. Somebody will throw a bomb into a group of police officers, and when it goes off, it convinces Americans that unions are full of dangerous, crazy anarchists, and they are very much dangerous for the United States. So the Knights of Labor are done at that point. The other major union at this time is the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, that's much more mild, moderate, and so they're pushing for bread and butter issues, and they only allowed skilled labor to join into their union, so not unskilled labor. It would be really good, though, for you to be able to cite strikes in both Panic of 1873 and 1893. So with 1873, they have something called the Great Railroad Strike, and they have another one in the 1890s that Grover Cleveland is going to short circuit by adding a mail car to every train in the United States. That then means that the unions are trying to block the delivery of federal mail, and that's going to be an offense that will then break the strike. They also, during the Panic of 1893, have the Homestead Strike, where you've got in Andrew Carnegie's steel mill a guy named Frick, who is Carnegie's right-hand man, who calls in security guards, and there's actual armed warfare outside the steel mill between the union and the agents that are happening for the business. When we look at then our next stage, they've now highlighted for you what's happening with northern cities. The South is involved too. They've got a process where they're trying to mimic what the North is up to with what's known as the New South. This is a movement created by people who have read the work of Hinton R. Helper, The Impending Crisis of the South, and even though he was ignored before the Civil War, they're now listening to the idea that they need to industrialize to catch up with the North and to catch up with Europe, otherwise they're going to keep slipping behind. The New South, though, is also incorporated with the idea of sharecropping, so African Americans will still remain in that business, and with the idea of segregation. So it's an idea of trying to update the South while also maintaining a class system that's keeping first and second class citizens separated from one another. Any questions about this page before we move? Sweet. This whole page right here is all about the farm protests and the populace. And so they're sending a signal to you that they want you to understand what is motivating the farmers to be pushing for change in the late 1800s. Our farm game is really good for this, just to get that perspective of what was going on with the farmers. And so you guys learned that during this time period there was improvements in mechanization that helped production increase substantially. And that's happening because farmers now have access to land with the Homestead Act. They're using the McCormick Reaper. They've got access to the railroads, so they can now mass produce food. The problem that you have is that when you massively increase the amount of food that you're making, what will it do to prices if demand stays the same? It's going to drop the prices, and so we're going to see a massive price drop, and so we're going to call that, what, is that inflation or deflation of farm goods? That is deflation. Fantastic. Now, being able to use those terms intelligently on the test puts you into an upper strata because those are more economic skills than U.S. history, but being able to flash those is good. So for farmers, they're going to argue that their decreasing farm prices are damaging, especially during the panics of 1873, 83, and 93, because many of those farmers are then struggling to make payments, and they are very mad about supply and demand. And so what they're going to be doing here, many farmers are responding to the increasing consolidation of agricultural markets and their dependence on the railroad. They're going to start creating cooperative organizations. Now, the first one to notice is just they do create groups called co-ops. And in co-ops or cooperatives, the farmers will work together to buy seed in bulk or buy other things in bulk. They might build a grain elevator together to try to figure out some ways to collaborate so that they can pool their resources and hopefully fight back a little bit. But your three groups that you should be noticing is, first of all, the Grange gets started in the 1870s by Oliver Keller here in Minnesota. It's a social club, first of all, sharing farm ideas as far as scientific methods to maximize your yield. But they start getting political, and they start creating what's known as Granger laws, which are very much anti-monopoly, anti-railroad laws. And the way you learned about these is you learned about a court case named Munn versus Illinois. And in the court case Munn versus Illinois, the state of Illinois agreed that they could that it was allowed to regulate railroad rates inside their state. Shortly afterwards, though, we had the Wabash cases. And in the Wabash cases, the Supreme Court reversed itself and said, no, the states cannot regulate a railroad that runs through multiple states. That's a federal issue, and that's going to lead to the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission that's supposed to be regulating those railroads. What you've already seen, though, is business and politics are closely entwined with one another, and so there's not going to be regulation of the railroads during that time period, and that's the same as the Sherman Antitrust Act. They're going to have a law on the books, but it's not really going to do much to change anything up. This will then lead to a brand new movement called the alliance system. And so you learn about like the Southern alliances and the Western alliances, where farmers are banding together in a region to get people elected, which is nice for state elections, but it's not really doing much on the national level. The Panic of 1893, though, is going to lead you to Box C. And the reason why the Panic of 1893 is going to destroy the party system is because for farmers, they got the feeling that Republicans were pro-monopolies. You saw after Garfield's election, they had something called the Mugwumps, the Stalwarts, and the Half-Breeds, all arguing over the spoils system and should that be used. And that allowed Grover Cleveland to get elected once. Then Benjamin Harrison came into the presidency, and then Grover Cleveland got elected again in 1892. In 1893, though, the entire market crashed, and it was during that crash that things really went wrong because the Sherman Silver Purchase Act started bankrupting the federal gold deposits. We had that funky thing where we were giving away gold at a discount if you traded silver in for gold, and so our gold is disappearing until we only had $40 million worth of gold left, and J.P. Morgan then had to bail out the United States government and save Grover Cleveland. For Grover Cleveland, he decided to get rid of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which made financial sense, but for the farmers who are populous, that is their simple solution to all of their problems, is using gold money will then create inflation. So that's what Box C is about, is you've got farmers who have all sorts of demands. They would like to get rid of like tariffs and replace them with property taxes or income taxes. They would love to have the direct election of senators, but they desperately want to have silver money to back up the money supply. You guys learned, though, in the election of 1896, William Jennings Bryan is going to get beaten by William McKinley, who wants the gold standard. And then we're going to discover gold in Alaska, which is going to cure a lot of our gold issues. And then McKinley's going to win again in 1900 over William Jennings Bryan once again. This is not going to stop reform, though, because in your next period, we'll learn about Teddy Roosevelt taking over from McKinley, and that's where our progressive movement will come from. Your next section. This is all about internal and external migration. So they want you to understand that movement pattern that's happening inside the United States. They would like you to understand that we've got immigrants coming from Asia and Southern and Eastern Europe, and we've also got African-American migrants moving inside of and out of the South post-Civil War. When you think about those immigrants coming over to the New World, those people are known as new immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, and they're running into an awful lot of nativism, which is what they're describing at the very bottom of that section. Many of these new immigrants are Catholic or Jewish, not Protestant. Many of them are unskilled and uneducated, which is frustrating a lot of Americans. For Asian people, you especially have a wave of Chinese people moving into the country to build the Transcontinental Railroad, but the railroads are explicitly trying to bring in only men so they can be here one generation and then pass away so there isn't a permanent class, and then they'll create the Chinese Exclusion Act to prevent more Chinese people from coming later. So there's a pattern that's going on right now to make sure we don't have another class of people who are not white who are developing into a self-sustaining society. We're going to find then that this nativism is going to cause a movement inwards, and so letter B talks about how there's going to be urban neighborhoods that are built based on particular ethnicities. Chinatowns, Little Italies. In Boston, you have a massive Irish population that's going to move in, and oftentimes they'll stay closely knit for protection from the nativists who don't really like them all that much. In box C, they just want you to understand the push towards assimilation and Americanization rather than the idea of holding on to previous backgrounds. The phrase that they use for that is melting pot. And so that's the American vision in the late 1800s, that we should be a melting pot where everybody blends in, gives up their cultural background, and everything is then set. Many people nowadays will challenge that by saying perhaps we're more of a salad bowl where you still retain your individuality, but you get all mixed up. And so those are the two big debate points we'll talk about in like a sociology class. Letter D. In the urban atmosphere, power was unequally distributed, and this is your key. Political machines are going to be thriving. So remember, immigrants oftentimes found their voting ability being used by political machines. The most famous of them was in New York with Tammany Hall. They were both Republican and Democratic political machines, but inside the city you had Democratic political machines that were pretty dominant. So Tammany Hall, led by Boss Tweed, is a very famous one. And remember what they're pursuing. They're looking to take advantage of graft, G-R-A-F-T, where they're trying to figure out ways to skim money out of the budget. So once Boss Tweed gets people elected and there's time to build a road or a building, he'll build those things, but then he's also going to overbill for his services so he can get rich on his own. Finally, down here in your bottom box, they're talking about a new set of working standards that are happening. We're now moving away from strictly farming. And there are definitely factory workers who are on the lowest level of society, but this is talking about middle to upper income workers who are white collar workers. They don't wear a blue denim shirt, but they wear a white shirt that they can keep clean throughout the day. And this is allowing a new different class of people to start emerging inside the United States. That middle class rather than the elite rich or the abject poor. It's going to be that opportunity then where you're not working from sun up to sundown that gives these people a chance to then get involved in leisure activities. So you're going to find inside the cities, this is where entertainment springs and sporting events and other sorts of cultural things that transforms the city from just trade to something different and more modern. Your next section, very super straightforward, and I typically find for my students this is not the page that requires a lot of review. Just a reminder, this is all about the explanation of what was going on with westward expansion in the United States in the late 1800s. So make sure you can talk about the importance of railroads in moving out west, the pursuit of resources, especially mineral resources. They're talking about mining for gold and silver, and government policies that promote economic growth like the Homestead Act and the Transcontinental Railroad. And it's going to create new cities out west as a result of all of this movement. In letter B, you're going to have people move out west for a variety of different reasons. And so what they highlight for you is they want to be able to talk specifically about building railroads, mining, farming, and ranching. If you can talk about those specific skill sets, those are the things that they'll want you to understand. Here in the state of Minnesota, lumber is also one of those big things, but they're telling you that that's not essential on the test. But if you understand that in the Northwoods we have large trees that are also attracting lumberjacks to help fill that need, that certainly won't hurt you on the test. Letter C, they want you to understand also that westward expansion leads to an ecological disaster with the death of massive numbers of buffalo. And they want you to be able to talk about what was going on between Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and the United States. So in southeastern American places, you see discrimination happening against Mexican Americans. When it comes to Native Americans, though, this box letter D is going to be your key for exploring that. So let me give you some incidents that we talked about in class when it came to Native American history. Number one, we learned about in the 1800s, Trail of Tears, during Jackson's time period, with the idea you move the Indians from the east, west of the Mississippi, into what was known as the Great American Desert. After the Civil War, though, you had a number of conflicts that we highlighted. During the Civil War, you had the Dakota conflict here in Minnesota. You also learn about Red Cloud's War along the Bozeman Trail, where they're going to burn down all sorts of forts to prevent westward movement. The most important turning point battle you want to be able to mention, though, is the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. It's at this Native American victory that the United States is going to then really dig in to fight against Native Americans. And I'd like to align for you what we talked about back then. In 1876, you have simultaneously Little Bighorn, plus the railroad strike that is going to be disrupting the cities, and the election of Hayes. So when Hayes decides to end military reconstruction in 1877, part of that reason is to pull the military from the south to the north to deal with uprisings, and take them out west to deal with the Native American threats. After that time, then, we talked about groups like the Nez Perce, who we saw going on the run to flee the United States government. You also learned about the massacre at Wounded Knee, which is going to be happening in the 1890s, and it's going to be the end of Native American resistance on the frontier. It's during this time period that we switch from the idea of just moving west of the Mississippi to the reservation policy. Eventually, the reservation policy is going to be tweaked again with the Dawes Severalty Act, and you're going to have then a shrinking even more of Native American land into homesteads, and the rest of the land will be taken away. We are going to see Native Americans trying to hold on to their cultural background, but remember, this is also the time of the Indian schools, most famously the Carlisle School, where they'll round up Native Americans, take them to school, and force them to give up their cultural heritage and try to assimilate. And so there's an active effort to try to root out the Native American while keeping the child so that they can then figure out ways to help them assimilate into white society. So any questions about the West and stuff that we need to know about for that? Sweet. They also want you to understand the intellectual movements that are talking about either reinforcing or undermining the Gilded Age. And what I need to warn you about is you see the words social and gospel weaving through all three of these, and this is a classic area where a lot of students will make mistakes because they just don't keep their stuff clear. So first of all, box number one, they want you to understand social Darwinism, the idea that they're taking Charles Darwin's ideas about evolution, survival of the fittest, and they're applying it to human beings, that there are elite and underclasses of human beings, and that's something that's just genetic and you can't work around it. So it's the idea that if you are somebody who's genetically going to elevate yourself, you're going to do that through your work ethic and perseverance, but if you don't, that's something that's then just inborn and you're going to be like that forever. So there's a feeling that you don't really work to help out the poor because of the fact that they are the way that they are. Andrew Carnegie is then going to try to figure out ways to work within that concept with his idea of the gospel of wealth, where he believes that if you're rich, you're the best person to know how to manage your money, and you should actually use your money while you're alive to try to help the situation of people who are poor. This is where you build ladders of prosperity with like opera houses and schools, colleges, libraries, and other sorts of things to provide culture and education and training for those who are willing to take that on. And for whoever doesn't, then that's part of their destiny, that they're destined to fall behind. Now you've had two, let me see, you've got gospel right here and gospel right here as well. Social gospel, so be careful with this. This is different than social Darwinism, different than the gospel of wealth. Social Darwinism is a Protestant progressive movement built on the idea that if Jesus was here, he wouldn't build poor people a library, he would actually try to help them escape poverty. And so inside the social gospel movement, this is where you have groups like the Salvation Army or your settlement houses. You've got people working actively to understand and work towards helping the poor, and they're going to be very much different than the gospel of wealth, with the idea that they're going to see flaws inside of our system that need to be corrected. This group in the bottom box, I would link them to the Panic of 1893, because in the Panic of 1893, many Americans are going to get turned off to social Darwinism when a bunch of people lose their jobs who are genetically just the same as when they had great jobs, and now they don't have great jobs. And so for many Americans, they're convinced that while it's nice to have the freedom to do what you want to do business-wise, certain regulations make sense in order to try to protect the society. In the late 1800s, then, you have brand new political debates that are taking place between your Republicans and Democrats. So let's highlight each of them. Number one, there is now, in the absence of abolitionism being an issue, there is a debate over what should be happening with tariffs. Farmers and poor people typically don't like the tariffs. Both Democrats and Republicans are pretty okay with them as they are protecting businesses. You have a debate over currency issues. Poor people want inflation, which is driving them towards wanting to keep greenbacks and to keep silver, while typically people who are more affluent want the gold standard, and they would prefer to have deflation so that they're able to have money that's worth more in smaller amounts. You're going to have reformers arguing that self-interest and economic greed has corrupted all levels of government. So let me give you some phrases to use with that. Remember, this is the era of the spoils system. And with political machines, this is the era of graft, where they're trying to figure out ways to scam money out of the government. The most corrupt of the presidencies in the late 1800s is Ulysses S. Grant. And so let me run you through the scandals that we talked about with him. First of all, the gold scheme, where you had Jay Gould, who came up with a plan to try to scam people with a monopoly over gold that ends up disrupting the markets quite heavily. You guys also learned about the whiskey ring, where you had politicians who were supposed to be collecting taxes on whiskey, but then they're getting bribed not to do so. You have the Indian land sales scandal, where people are selling Indian land that they're not allowed to do so that they can get money on the side. And then the biggest scandal for Grant is the Credit Mobilier Company, where the Union Pacific Railroad builds a fake company to double bill the government, and in order to not get busted, they're going to bribe Congress and the vice president with stock so that they become part owners in the company that is now doing business with the government. So we're going to find that for a lot of Americans, they're going to see the federal government, Democrat or Republican, as being a scam, and they're going to be very suspicious of this. It's going to lead a lot of women into reform movements. The amendments that you want to be able to use with women as bookends is at the start of any women's essay, I would start with the 14th and 15th Amendment. Because the 14th Amendment gives citizenship to everybody in the United States, but the 15th only gives voting rights to African American men. From this point forward, then, women are going to split from the African American civil rights movement, and they're going to be pushing for a lot of changes. Like it says, joining voluntary organizations. Let me remind you of a couple of them. You have the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU. And as a bookend, I would then bookend your 14th and 15th Amendments with their goal, which turns into the 18th Amendment. So when women go off on their own, they're pursuing other changes to the Constitution. You also have the suffragettes. And with the suffragettes, they're going to eventually lead to the 19th Amendment after being denied with the 15th. You'll also notice that there are immigrants who are involved in this question with settlement houses. You'll want to definitely be able to weave Jane Addams in and her work inside the cities to try to help out people who are in difficult situations. For letter D, they also want to be able to speak intelligently about the African American experience from 1865 to 1900. And specifically, we've already covered that in the last period when we talked about Reconstruction. So the failure of Reconstruction in 1877 is going to then establish the idea of black codes, Jim Crow laws, segregation, sharecropping, lynchings. So you've got all these negative elements that are taking place. Eventually, that gets cemented in the 1890s with Plessy versus Ferguson and the concept of separate but equal. African Americans are facing increased violence, discrimination, scientific theories about the inferiority of African Americans, but they mention African American reformers continue to fight for political and social equality during this time period. So let me give you the big three and their names that you want to be able to hold on to, and they're ones that we referenced when we did the Civil Rights Unit about a month ago. First of all, Booker T. Washington, that guy who delivered the Atlanta Exposition speech. where you ask people to cast down their buckets where they are and hire black people to work inside of factories so they could move off the plantations for sharecropping. Booker T. Washington even proposes that he train African Americans at Tuskegee Institute or other black colleges so that they can then have the skills to handle factory work. He is being opposed by W.E.B. Du Bois, who is going to come at the end of this time period and at the beginning of the 1900s. So he bridges these two times. And Du Bois's idea is the talented 10th. Find the top 10% of African Americans, train them up as leaders, and help them then go out to try to elevate the rest of the race. The final person I would mention in that box is Ida B. Wells. And Ida B. Wells is famous because she would document all these lynchings that took place throughout the United States. She would then put them in her books to show to people around the United States that the South wasn't as pure and as nice as they claimed to be, and her cause was to be against lynching, to try to turn that around. This is the late 1800s, essentially, and obviously we've covered it quick, so there's a lot of details you can fill in with specific facts and named dates. Are there any things during this time, though, that you've got questions or problems about? You have covered the majority of the material that will typically cause problems on the AP test. Next week's review, though, 1890 to 1940, is two time periods of a ton of legislation. Progressive Era and New Deal have a lot of specific names, dates, facts, and so that's where we really want to tune in with that sort of stuff. But being more recent, most likely to lock in a lot easier for you to be able to recall. If you need any help with any of this stuff, let me know. But again, I admire you guys for coming in and doing this work. If you have any problems, I'd love to help. Thanks, guys.